All right, so I've got all of our middle supports cut to length that are going to go between our front and back stretchers. And all these supports are meant to do is just keep this stuff moving in a solid structure. So if we allow these pieces to kind of move independently, there's a good chance that they'll warp and pinch the drawers. But if we tie them together with a few stretchers, it's going to make them a lot stronger. Also, in the middle area here, this is where we're going to be cutting in our main divider panels that we're going to be mounting drawer slides in that too. And so we're going to start by cutting just a normal 1/2 inch long tenon on one end, and then we'll work on fitting up the other end with a little bit of a tighter tolerance. So we'll start by moving the fence a little bit closer to the blade, giving us less than a 1/2 inch long tenon. Then we'll slowly sneak it back till we get a precision fit into our different pieces here. So because all of our components are going to be the exact same dimensions, it's going to be really easy to start gluing these up. If you have a lot of clamps in your shop, I would highly recommend doing one frame at a time because that's going to be the easiest option, because all you have to do is apply a little bit of the glue to the tenons, put them together, and you're just focusing on getting that one frame in there. But the problem is I don't have a whole lot of clamps. So what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be buddying up these pipe clamps and then throwing a clamp across the middle. So this is a pretty simple process. These pipe clamps have about a 2-inch face there, so it's got plenty of space to fit in multiple of these frames and holding them tight enough together. Now what you may have to watch out for is some clamps have an angled face, so if they have that angled face, just put like a board or something in there to create even clamping pressure between the two. But yeah, you just have to watch out for that. And so the other thing you have to consider is that you don't want these two frames getting stuck together. So you can either throw a little bit of parchment paper over the glue joints, or you can just throw some stickers across. And so I've got these white oak stickers from, I don't know, tons of leftovers from other projects and that. And so all we do is just lay them out and set the other frame on top of those, and that'll create enough space in between them to make sure the glue from one doesn't stick to the other one. All right, so while the frames are drying, we can start working on our bottom frame. Now our bottom frames are different because obviously we have our bottom stretcher that is a vertical one rather than a horizontal one like the rest of them. So the length of all of our in-between dividers changes slightly, and we need to have a little bit of different joinery. And so I've got the bottom for the tall dresser all finished up here. I glued this up yesterday, and we're going to talk about the mistake that I made here pretty quickly, but I just want to show you guys the process because I wanted to figure this out for myself first before I tried to show it on camera and before I did the long one, because the long one is going to be even more complex than this one was. And so basically all I did is when I had everything set up and put together, when I was cutting the tenons for the backside, I used the exact same setup to just cut a rabbet on the front side. And so then on the front stretcher, I just cut a little pocket right into the front here and stuck some dowels in to just create a little bit of strength. This will just prevent it from getting pulled out. Now the one downside to this joint is obviously that this piece of wood can come vertically up and outwards. And so the dowels are also kind of helping to keep that in. And so the important thing here is that you want to make sure that when you're fitting these ones up, you're fitting them up at the same time and basically the same way that you're fitting up the rest of them so that everything comes out the same length. Now going through and measuring out now, this frame comes out from front to back, comes out to precisely 19 1/4, the exact same as all of our other frames, which is perfect. And so the one mistake that I made on this frame that was actually, I'm kind of impressed with myself at the moment for fixing it, is I forgot to cut this curve into the top stretcher. So you can see here that we got that nice gentle curve going through. It's already all swooped and everything's all nicely finished up there. So when I glued this up, I just completely forgot to cut that curve in there. And so typically my process for cutting a curve into a piece would be I'd take it to the bandsaw, cut that nice curve, and then I'd clean up that curve on the spindle sander or my belt sander, my little Redridge belt sander. Now obviously with this piece as tall as it is, I couldn't pass it to the bandsaw, so I just used a jigsaw to cut that curve. I was very careful with my lines, and I ended up staying quite a ways away from my lines because when you're cutting with a jigsaw, that blade is not going to stay at 90 degrees. It's going to curve, it's going to do all kinds of stupid things because jigsaws are just not precise tools. They're not designed to be, they're not meant to be a precise tool. And so after that, I tried to clean it up on the spindle sander. You can see it set up behind me there with the 2-inch spindle on it, and that just wasn't working. I kept getting these little dishes in that just because it's really hard to control a piece this tall, and I couldn't see my line that I had drawn in the front. So the solution to that is I just clamped it to the workbench here, took out my handy dandy spoke shave, and just cleaned up that surface. And so the benefit of cleaning up with the spoke shave is it's very similar to hand planing a surface. It makes sure that there's no little bumps in that, like what the sander leaves. So it makes a perfectly smooth surface, and it's very easy to take off, very delicate amounts of material over a distance here. And so I could just keep working the curve either side, in the middle and all that, precisely until my pencil line was gone. As soon as my pencil line was gone, I just left that area alone and worked on another area. So it was a very good clean process, and I think that's how I'm actually going to clean up the other one. Okay, so please excuse the sound of the heater in the background. It's like minus 30 here in Calgary today, so I have to keep the heater running for most of the day because it's bloody freezing. But anyway, I wanted to talk about how you actually align this middle one. Because obviously our end ones are very easy. We just align them to the edges, and as long as they're square to those edges, it's easy. Whereas if we try to transfer this middle one across, we don't really have any good areas to gas in here. Now, one trick would be that you can measure. Now, the trick with that is I don't know if my piece is going to be perfectly centered in this mortise. Now, it should be perfectly centered on this backboard, but there's no guarantee. And so to do this, it's pretty simple. All you're going to do is just line up your piece into your mortise that you got on your back piece here, because you know exactly what that's going to line up. Then you're just going to put some pencil marks right in the corners there, and then this becomes super easy, because now all you have to do is transfer those marks from this back piece onto your front piece, because we know that our front and back pieces are the exact same length. So as long as I line them up, transfer those marks across, everything will line up perfectly when we go to put this thing together. Okay, so we've got all of our frames out of the clamps now. That was a lot of work gluing those up. I only showed the first 2 that I did. The rest that I did were all spread all over the floor of the shop here, and were really painful to do because it just meant crawling around on the floor, on my knees. Super uncomfortable, but they're all out of clamps now and they're all ready to go. They just need to be cleaned up. But we still have a few more frames to glue up before we can actually really keep moving on with this project, and that is the middle frame on the tall dresser and the 2 frames on the nightstands. Now all 3 of these frames have a filled center section, so we need a panel that's going to go in the middle area to just make sure that nothing can fall through the frame because these are going to be exposed. So on the tall dresser, this is going to be a cabinet in this area, so we need to make sure that we have that bottom shelf in place, and on the nightstands, it's just going to be an open shelf. And so when we were doing our pre-milling phase, we were breaking down all our lumber, gluing up all of our panels, I totally forgot to make a panel to put in these places. But now that I think about it, that's actually a really good thing, because what I'm going to be doing here is a little bit because I'm lazy, because I don't want to go through all the effort of gluing up a panel, but it's also going to be a much more reliable method. Because all we're going to be doing is taking some pieces and laying them out on the middle here, and we're going to be cutting some tongue and groove joints and then cutting some tenons on the end of them to fit them into the grooves on the sides here. So the benefit of this is by having each of these pieces laid out individually, all with their own ability to move around and do whatever they need to do, that's going to allow for a lot of wood movement that a solid panel wouldn't allow for. Because if you think about it, contained in this small area, we don't have a lot of room for movement in there. Everything's kind of tied together. So if you have a fairly tight-fitting panel in there and it decides to expand a lot over its width, it's going to rip this whole center shelf apart. And so the benefit of this is keeping these pieces individual lets them overlap each other rather than pushing outwards on this frame. So the best way to think about it is this piece will have a tenon on it, a big long tenon right along the long grade here. This side will have a groove on it. As this piece expands, it will go more so into this piece. Vice versa, if this piece expands to the right, it'll just cover up this piece a little bit more. So we'll leave little grooves in here to allow for that wood movement, but it'll be a lot less wood movement compared to if this whole panel was expanding and contracting. So it'll just make sure that this middle shelf is as stable as possible. And so when you're fitting up your tongue and groove, what you're aiming for is you want to make sure that when you fill all your pieces together, you push them together tightly, that you have a small gap at the backside here. So I know that this front piece is lined up with this front edge, and I have all these pieces pushed together as close as they can go. Now you can see here that we have a little gap between them. That's very intentional. It's about a 64th of an inch. And so what'll happen is that when we go to glue this thing up and we start aligning things, when we pull this piece back and we start moving this little gap all the way throughout these pieces, we'll have just about a 32nd of an inch between each of these pieces of wood. Now it's important to have that gap at the back when everything is compressed, because that means when you glue this thing up, your tongues are not going to be touching inside of your groove. Because if your tongues are pressed up right against the inside of your groove there, it's not going to have any room to expand and contract. Whereas when you pull it back that 32nd of an inch, I now know that there's going to be a 32nd of an inch gap between the tongue and the groove in there. So there will be room for that wood to expand and contract. Now the larger pieces of wood that you have, so if we went up to like 4 or 5 inches, we'd want to basically double that width. Now we're going to go through in here and add a little bit of a V groove to each one of these just using the table saw, and I'll show you guys how to do that in a little bit here. Because all I want to do here is I want to make sure that this stays looking like an individual panel. Because we have such varied pieces, you can see we've got some cathedral grains in here, we've got some very straight grain. I want to make sure that each one of these pieces is obviously their own piece of wood, because I think that brings a lot of visual interest to it.